The night I saw him, I was already old. Too old to dream, too old to hope, too tired to keep asking God for what he seemed to delay forever. But that night, the air in the temple changed. I felt it before I saw it. A peace so thick it made my heart tremble. Footsteps echoed, small, soft, holy. And when I turned, I saw a young woman holding a baby. Something inside me broke open. I didn't need a prophet to tell me who he was. My soul already knew. The child she carried was the one we had all been waiting for. The one I had spent my whole life praying to see. My knees went weak. My lips began to shake. And for the first time in decades I wept, not for sorrow but for fulfillment. I had waded through widowhood, hunger, silence, and years of people calling me forgotten. But in that single heartbeat I realized heaven never forgot me. I was Anna, the prophetess who waited her whole life. And this is how God turned waiting into wonder. Let me take you back to where it all began. I was once a girl with laughter in my voice and dreams in my eyes. The streets of Jerusalem were my world. Narrow stone paths filled with traders calling out their prices, children running after pigeons, and old men sitting under olive trees telling stories of kings and prophets. I loved walking through the markets, smelling the freshly baked bread and hearing the temple bells from far away. Every time I heard them, something inside me stirred. Even before I understood what it meant to serve God, I felt drawn to him. I still remember the first day I met my husband. He was young, kind, and quiet. His eyes had peace in them, the kind that made you feel safe just by standing near him. He was gentle when he spoke, like he carried secrets of heaven in his heart. When he asked for my hand, I thought my life was just beginning. Our wedding was small, simple, but filled with joy. We danced under the stars, surrounded by family and laughter. I remember thinking, this is what joy feels like. This is what forever must be. For a few short years we lived that quiet forever. Mornings filled with prayer, evenings filled with laughter. I would cook while he sang softly from the Psalms. Our home was small but it felt full of warmth, full of promise, full of love. And then, everything changed. He fell sick suddenly. No warning, no reason. Just pain that came like a thief and refused to leave. I prayed, I fasted, I begged. Every night I laid my head on the floor and whispered, God, please, not yet. Not him. But heaven was silent. I watched the color fade from his face, the strength leave his hands. One evening he looked at me, smiled weakly and said, Anna, don't let grief take your faith. Promise me that. And then he was gone. The house grew cold that night. The world turned quiet, cruelly quiet. The same temple bells that once filled me with peace now sounded like a cry I could not bear. I was a widow before my hair even turned gray. My heart felt like it had been buried with him. Every day after his death felt endless, like walking through fog that never lifted. People told me to remarry. You're still young, they said. You can start again. But something in me knew I couldn't go back to what was. I couldn't fill the space he left with another name. The love I had wasn't just between us. It had grown into something larger, a hunger for God himself. So I made my choice. I left my home and went to the temple. The priests didn't understand. Some thought I was lost. Others pitied me. But I wasn't running from pain. I was walking into purpose, though I didn't know it yet. The temple became my shelter, my school, my world. I began to wake before dawn, just to be near the sound of worship. I learned to sweep the courtyards, light lamps, and listen to the scriptures being read aloud. The smell of incense became my comfort, the sound of prayers became my music. In the early days the grief still burned. There were nights I sat alone by the temple gate, watching couples pass by, hearing laughter that reminded me of what I lost. Tears would fall without warning. But instead of letting them drown me, I turned them into prayers. I started whispering instead of weeping. I began to talk to God the way I once spoke to my husband, with trust, with honesty, with love. And little by little something began to shift inside me. Grief became a language between me and heaven. I started to see that loss was not the end but an altar, a place where I could lay everything down. There were days when the ache came back sharp and sudden. I would stand in the temple holding my chest, whispering, "Why me, Lord?" And in that stillness I would feel it, not an answer but a peace that said, "You're not alone." People around me moved on. They married, they laughed, they grew old with their children. I had none of that. My hair turned gray earlier than most. My hands grew thin from fasting. But my heart grew strong. I began to notice things others missed. The way sunlight touched the altar, the way the priest's prayers rose like smoke and faded into the sky. I started to sense God in the smallest things, in the sound of footsteps, in the sigh of wind through the temple curtains. Sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I felt like he was sitting beside me. No words, just presence. And I realized something I never thought I would. I was no longer just a widow. I was a worshiper. I didn't belong to anyone anymore, but I was not empty. My pain had become my prayer, my waiting had become my worship, and my silence had become the space where God spoke. Years would pass before I understood why he let me lose everything so young. But even then, deep down, I knew he was shaping me, not for sorrow but for something sacred. Every night before I closed my eyes, I whispered one simple line. I have lost everything, but I still have you. And somehow that was enough. The first morning I woke up inside the temple courtyard, the air felt different, clean, holy, still. It was quiet enough to hear my own heartbeat. The stone floor was cold beneath my feet, but I didn't mind. The temple had become my home now. Not by plan but by promise. I didn't know how long I would stay. I just knew I couldn't leave. At dawn, when the first light touched the walls, I rose from my mat. I tied my shawl around my shoulders and walked slowly toward the inner gate. The smell of incense greeted me, soft and sweet. The priests were already preparing the morning sacrifices. Their voices murmured in prayer, mixing with the rustle of doves' wings and the distant cries of merchants opening their stalls beyond the walls. Every sound, every movement, it all felt sacred. Even the dust seemed to shine when sunlight entered the courtyard. My work began with lighting the lamps. It was a small task, but I treated it like worship. Each flame I lit reminded me that even in my darkness, God's light still burned. I would whisper as I touched the wick, "You are the light that never dies." Day after day I served in small ways, sweeping the floors, helping widows find food, comforting those who came with broken hearts. And when the temple grew silent, I prayed. I prayed until my words ran out. Then I would just sit there in stillness, letting my tears do the talking. Fasting became my way of speaking without words. Every hunger pain was a reminder that this body is only temporary, but the soul is eternal. People often looked at me with pity. They whispered when I passed. "There she is, the old widow who never left the temple," they said. Some called me strange. Others called me cursed. But I didn't mind. They saw an old woman. God saw a watchwoman. There were times I laughed quietly when people pitied me. If only they knew. If only they felt what I felt when I prayed. There is a joy the world cannot understand. The joy that comes when heaven becomes your closest friend. My life became a rhythm of prayer and silence, light and shadow. Morning to night I stayed. The temple pillars felt like old friends. The marble floors remembered my footsteps. I knew every crack, every echo. And though it was not mine by blood, it had become mine by devotion. When families came to dedicate their children, I stood nearby, praying blessings over them. When the poor came with tired eyes, I whispered hope over their pain. When travelers entered confused and burdened, I greeted them with a quiet smile. Some days I felt invisible, but I learned that invisibility is not the same as being forgotten. In the stillness I felt seen, not by men but by God Himself. At night, when the lamps flickered and the stars shone above the temple roof, I would sit under the open sky. The city would hum in the distance, but the temple stayed peaceful. The moonlight touched the stones, turning everything silver and still. That was when I spoke to God most deeply. Not with long prayers but with whispers. "Are you still there?" I would ask softly. And somehow every time I felt Him answer in the wind that brushed against my face. I began to see Him in everything. In the morning birds that circled above the altar, in the fire that never went out, in the faces of strangers who came seeking mercy. Every day was the same, yet every day was new. Sometimes I watched the young priests walk by, laughing and talking, their lives ahead of them. And for a moment I wondered what mine might have been if my husband had lived. But the thought never stayed long. Because even without knowing it, I had chosen the better love, the one that never dies. Children grew up and returned to the temple with families of their own. Generations passed before my eyes. I grew older, slower, but never empty. My hands were weak, but my spirit grew stronger. There were days I fasted so long my body trembled. But even in weakness I felt alive. There is a kind of strength that comes only when all you have left is God. I became known as the woman who prayed. Some laughed, others bowed their heads in respect. I didn't care for either. I wasn't doing it to be seen. I was doing it because His presence had become my home. Years turned into decades. My hair turned white. My skin wrinkled like parchment. But inside me the same fire still burned. Every morning I lit the lamps again. Every night I knelt in silence. Every season I waited, though I didn't yet know what I was waiting for. There were moments when I thought, maybe this is all my life will ever be. But then a quiet voice inside whispered, keep waiting. And so I did. Waiting didn't feel like punishment anymore. It felt like preparation. The silence of God was no longer a burden. It was a conversation only the patient could hear. Sometimes I felt His presence so close it made my heart ache. Sometimes I felt nothing but the echo of my own breath. Yet I stayed. I always stayed. I stopped counting years. The temple became my family, my friend, my world. It wasn't walls and altars to me anymore. It was where heaven met earth. And every time the sun rose, I whispered the same words. I am still here, Lord. Still waiting. Still yours. One night I woke before dawn and looked at the stars above the temple. They glittered like promises that never fade. I smiled and said quietly, the world may forget me, but you never will. And in that stillness I knew it was true. Years turned into decades. The temple walls that once looked bright and new grew older just like me. The stones darkened with time, the gold edges dulled a little, and the young priests who once smiled at me grew gray-haired and slow. But I was still there. I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, and even if I did, I wouldn't have left. The temple wasn't only my home anymore. It was my heartbeat. It was where I met God every morning, even when He felt silent. I learned to read the rhythm of days. I could tell the hour by how the sunlight touched the floor, or how the pigeons gathered near the courtyard well. The same steps echoed every day, yet none of them felt the same. Sometimes I would sit near the entrance where mothers brought their babies for dedication. I would watch them walk in with nervous joy, tiny blankets wrapped around soft faces. The smell of milk and oil filled the air. I always smiled, but inside a small ache would wake. Each child reminded me of what I never had, of what death took too soon. Yet instead of letting that pain turn bitter, I turned it into blessing. I prayed over every child who passed before me. I whispered, may this one grow strong. May this one love God early. May this one live for what I never saw. There were days when it hurt so much I couldn't breathe. Watching life bloom around you when your own dreams had turned to dust is not easy. But I learned something beautiful. You can find joy even in someone else's miracle. I started talking to God like He was my closest friend. There were no fancy words anymore. Just conversations whispered into the air. Lord, I'd say softly, how long will your silence last? And sometimes I'd laugh right after, but it's fine. I'll wait. I told Him everything, when I was tired, when I was hungry, when I was lonely. He was the only one who truly listened. There were no visions, no angels, no booming voices. Just peace, quiet, deep, holy peace that came like a blanket every time I prayed. I watched Jerusalem change. Children I once prayed for became parents. The noise of the city grew louder, markets busier, soldiers harsher. Empires shifted, rulers changed, yet the temple always stood. And so did I. The priests came and went. Some forgot my name. Others called me the praying widow. I didn't mind. I wasn't praying to be remembered by them. I was praying to be remembered by Him. Winter after winter I wrapped myself in old wool, lighting the lamps with trembling hands. Summer after summer I wiped sweat from my face as I fasted under the burning heat. Some nights I lay awake, staring at the temple ceiling, asking, will I die here, Lord? Will I ever see the promise you spoke to our fathers? There was no answer, only silence. But it wasn't the silence of absence anymore. It was the silence of presence, quiet, steady, patient. I began to understand that waiting wasn't wasted time. Waiting was worship. Each day I stayed was a declaration that I believed God still remembered Israel. There were days I felt weak, days I wondered if my life mattered at all. Then someone would walk by, a widow crying, a child praying, a man limping from battle, and I would see it again. Pain everywhere, hope thin as thread. And I knew, my prayers were needed. My voice mattered even if no one heard it but heaven. I had become part of the temple's rhythm. When the horns sounded, I prayed. When the sacrifices burned, I prayed. When the crowds left, I prayed. It wasn't duty anymore, it was love. The young women sometimes asked me, "Anna, how do you keep praying after all these years?" I smiled and said, "Because he still breathes." They didn't understand, but I didn't need them to. You don't need to see him to know he's there. You just need to stay long enough to feel the warmth in the silence. I began to see how faith works like sunrise. Slow, quiet, unseen at first, but always coming. Every wrinkle on my skin told a story of prayer. Every line near my eyes carried laughter and tears, both offered to God. My body grew frail, but my heart became like fire. Sometimes when I walked past the holy court, I felt a pull in my chest. Not pain, a knowing. Something deep whispered that the story wasn't over. That one day the silence would break. I didn't know how or when, but I knew. And I smiled every time that thought came because I wanted to be there when it happened. Years kept folding into one another. Time became a river that carried me forward quietly. The world outside changed. New rulers, new taxes, new tongues in the marketplace, but I stayed. No matter what came, I stayed. Every morning before anyone else woke, I stood in the temple court looking toward the sunrise, whispering, "Still here, Lord. Still waiting." And every evening before I slept, I whispered, "Thank you for one more day of waiting." There is a strange kind of peace that comes when you stop counting years. When you stop asking when and just start saying yes. My hope was not a flame anymore. It was a steady glow. My prayers were not cries anymore. They were conversations. I had long stopped asking God to change my story. Instead, I began to ask Him to change hearts. My own included. I wanted to see His promise before I died, yes. But even if I didn't, I wanted to die believing it was still coming. Faith, I learned, is not about seeing what you prayed for. It's about still praying when you can't see anything at all. Some days the temple felt too big. My voice felt too small. But I whispered anyway. Because every whisper still reached Him. I had grown from a young widow into an old prophetess. From a woman of sorrow into a woman of sight. Not sight with the eyes, but sight of the heart. And though my knees shook and my hands trembled, my spirit stood tall. The world outside grew older, but my hope stayed young. Some promises take a lifetime, but I had decided to wait a lifetime if I must. It began quietly. Not with thunder. Not with visions. Just a stillness. The kind that feels like the air itself is holding its breath. One morning, while I prayed in my usual place beside the eastern wall, something unusual filled my heart. It wasn't fear. It wasn't even joy. It was peace, strange, deep, and alive. It wrapped around me like a soft voice I could not yet hear but somehow understood. Something is coming. I remember looking around the temple that day, expecting to see someone standing near me. But there was no one. The priests went about their duties. The doves fluttered. Children ran past the gates. Life continued, ordinary and loud. Yet beneath all that noise, heaven was whispering. I didn't tell anyone. I only prayed longer. The peace did not leave. It stayed like a flame that would not go out. That night I dreamed. It wasn't like other dreams that fade by morning. This one stayed. I saw light, blinding, golden light, filling the temple. And a voice, gentle as a breath, said, "He is near." When I woke up, my heart was beating fast. I sat up in the darkness, trembling. I had seen nothing, but I knew it wasn't just a dream. The Spirit of God had touched me. Days turned into weeks and the feeling grew stronger. Every prayer, every song, every whisper of incense smoke rising, all of it felt like a countdown. Something holy was drawing near. I began to notice another face in the temple, an old man named Simeon. His beard was white, his back slightly bent, but his eyes, oh, his eyes burned with the same fire I felt inside. We would sometimes meet in silence, both praying at opposite sides of the court. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and the light turned golden, Simeon walked toward me slowly. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at me and I knew. The same whisper that had reached me had reached him too. "The Spirit has told me," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I will not die until I have seen the Lord's Messiah." Tears filled my eyes. I took his hand and whispered, "Then we wait together." From that day on we prayed side by side. No one understood why two old people spent their days sitting near the same spot, faces lifted to the sky. But we knew what we were waiting for. Sometimes as we prayed I would feel a warmth sweep through me like sunlight inside my chest. It would make my hands tremble. I didn't hear words but I could feel them. He is coming. He is close. Even when nothing changed, my heart danced with hope. I began to dream again. In one dream I saw the temple gates open and a flood of light poured in. Touched everything, the altars, the walls, even the floor beneath my knees. And I heard laughter, the laughter of a child. When I woke my face was wet with tears. I told Simeon. He smiled and said, "The time is nearer than we think." From then on, every sound in the temple made my heart leap. The creak of the door, the cry of a baby, the footsteps of strangers. Any of them could be the sign. I would look up from prayer, half expecting to see him. Years of silence had trained my ears to hear what others missed. When the Spirit moves, it is not always loud. Sometimes, it comes as a soft whisper that only faith can recognize. One evening as I sat watching the last light fade from the sky, the Spirit spoke to my heart again. Not with words but with knowing. I felt it like a river moving through me. The wait is almost over. I pressed my hands over my heart and began to weep, not from sadness but from something deeper, awe. I could feel God's heartbeat within mine. For the first time in years I sang out loud. My voice cracked, weak and old, but it filled the empty courtyard. I sang of mercy, of promises kept, of hope that never dies. People stopped to stare. Some smiled, others shook their heads. But I didn't care. I wasn't singing to them. I was singing to the one who had promised to come. Simeon found me the next morning. His face looked brighter, his step lighter. "It won't be long," he said, gripping my hands. "I feel it too." I nodded, tears spilling again. We were both old, closer to the end than the beginning, but that didn't matter. The wait had given us new life. Every day after that I felt the same stirring, gentle, constant, like a heartbeat beneath the silence. The Spirit's whisper followed me wherever I went. Even the shadows in the temple seemed to glow differently. I started to smile more. My body was frail, my bones ached, but my spirit felt like it had learned to dance again. I knew what it meant now, that waiting is not empty when God is the one you're waiting for. He was coming. The promise was near. The day began like every other day. The temple was busy, filled with the sound of sandals against stone, the low murmur of prayers, and the cooing of doves waiting for sacrifice. The smell of incense curled through the air, sweet and heavy. I was in my usual place near the eastern wall, my old hands resting on my knees, whispering the same prayer I had whispered for years. "Lord, let me see your salvation before my eyes close." The sun poured through the high windows, painting gold on the floor. Everything looked the same. Ordinary. Until it wasn't. I felt it before I saw it. The air changed. It was as if something holy had stepped into the room, something invisible yet too real to deny. The noise around me faded. My breath caught. Every hair on my skin rose. Something was happening. I looked toward the entrance, my heart suddenly racing though I didn't know why. And then I saw them. A young couple had just entered. They looked like any other parents bringing their child to the temple. The man was simple, strong, quiet. The woman, her face was gentle, her eyes tired but glowing with something I had never seen before. She held a baby in her arms. My heart began to tremble. I couldn't explain it, but my spirit knew before my mind did. Every whisper, every dream, every year of waiting, it was leading to this moment. He was here. The Messiah. The promise. The one. The spirit inside me rose like a wave. My old knees weakened. Tears filled my eyes until I could hardly see. The child's cry echoed softly through the courtyard, and it sounded like the breaking of a 400-year silence. Simeon was there that day too. I watched as he walked toward them, his face radiant, his hands shaking. The young couple looked at him with wonder, unsure, but they didn't move away. He took the baby in his arms, his wrinkled hands trembling, his lips quivering as he looked up to heaven. "Lord," he whispered, "now let your servant depart in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation." His voice cracked, but his words filled the temple like music. I could feel heaven leaning close. As he blessed the child, I moved closer. My body was slow, but my spirit ran. My heart beat like it had found its home. The woman, Mary, I would later learn her name, looked up and saw me. Our eyes met. I don't know if she understood what I knew, but in that glance something passed between us. Recognition. The light around her seemed to move, like every ray of sun had gathered just for her and the baby she held. When I reached them, I couldn't speak. My hands shook as I looked at the child wrapped in soft cloth. His eyes were closed, his tiny hand gripping Mary's robe. And in that instant I knew. I had waited my whole life for this face. All the years of fasting, all the nights of tears, all the days of silence, they had led to this. I fell to my knees. The stone floor was hard beneath me, but I didn't feel it. My heart felt too full for pain. "Blessed be the Lord," I whispered, my voice breaking. "He has visited his people." The air felt electric, alive with the presence of God. Even the priests nearby paused in their movements, as if time itself was bowing. I reached out my trembling hands, not to touch but to honor. My lips could barely form the words. "This is him," I whispered to Simeon. "The one we waited for." He nodded, tears streaming down his beard. "He is the light for the nations," he said. And as the child moved slightly in his mother's arms, my tears spilled freely. His tiny breath seemed to fill the whole world. I remembered every lonely night, every unanswered prayer, every season that felt endless. And suddenly none of it felt wasted. Every tear had watered this moment. Every waiting year had prepared my heart for this sight. I didn't feel old anymore. I didn't feel tired. I felt alive, more alive than I had ever been. It was as if all of heaven had stepped into that small corner of the temple, hidden in the arms of a young mother. I could feel the Spirit whispering again. "This is what you were born for, Anna." And I knew it was true. I had spent decades watching other people's joy, other people's blessings. But now, God Himself had come near enough to see my face. I wanted to stay there forever. I didn't want to blink, afraid that if I did, the vision might vanish. But this was no vision. It was real. Flesh and blood. Heaven in human form. The world outside the temple didn't know. The merchants still shouted in the streets, the soldiers still marched, the people still hurried by, blind to the miracle standing in their midst. But I knew. Simeon knew. Mary and Joseph knew. And God knew that His promise had been fulfilled. When the baby opened his eyes for a brief moment, he looked my way. It was just a baby's gaze, innocent, quiet, but it felt like he was looking straight into my soul. I felt warmth flood through me, like sunlight touching frozen ground. The years of waiting melted away in an instant. I wept and I laughed through my tears. The sound surprised even me. The Savior was here, not on a throne but in a mother's arms. Not surrounded by soldiers but by silence. Not robed in gold but wrapped in swaddling cloth. And yet He was greater than any king I had ever imagined. The child's cry faded softly as Mary rocked him gently. And I knew that my story, all my pain, all my waiting had finally found its meaning. I whispered a prayer that rose from the deepest part of me. "Now my eyes have seen your promise, Lord. You can take me whenever you will." And as I looked once more at the baby's face, I felt something like eternity settle inside my chest. It was peace. Pure, complete peace. I had seen countless babies in my lifetime. I had watched parents bring their firstborns to the temple, their faces glowing with joy and trembling with fear. I had seen tiny hands wave in the air, and soft cries echo beneath the high stone walls. But this child, this one, was different. From the moment I saw him, I knew. The air itself felt alive. The temple seemed to hum with something unseen, something holy. My heart trembled. My knees felt weak. My hands shook as if every drop of blood in my body had awakened after a long sleep. Mary smiled gently as I came closer. She didn't say a word. She just looked at me as if she already knew that I knew. My lips quivered. I could hardly breathe. I reached out slowly, afraid that even the smallest movement might break the sacred stillness that surrounded him. When my fingers brushed the edge of his blanket, my tears fell, not from sadness but from something far deeper. Worship. The kind of worship that words cannot hold. The baby stirred softly, a faint sigh escaping his lips. His tiny hand moved, curling around nothing, and yet it felt like he was holding the whole world. And in that instant I understood. This was the one the prophet spoke of. The one the stars pointed to. The one the angels had sung about in the night skies. The one my heart had waited for all these years. My trembling hands lifted slightly, not to take him from his mother but to honor him. "My Lord," I whispered, barely able to form the words, "you have come." The tears wouldn't stop. They fell freely, soaking into the fabric of my robe. My soul felt too full for my body. Simeon stood beside me, his face glowing with the same holy fire that burned within me. His arms still cradled the child as he lifted his eyes toward heaven. His voice broke the silence. "This child," he said, "is destined for the rise and fall of many in Israel. He will be a light to the nations and the glory of his people." Every word felt like a trumpet in my heart. Mary's eyes filled with quiet wonder. Joseph stood behind her, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The air shimmered with peace, but beneath that peace I could sense power, quiet, unstoppable, eternal. I began to speak without even meaning to. My voice rose not from my throat but from my soul. Came out like a song, shaky, loud, full of joy that sounded like laughter and crying all at once. "Praise be to God," I cried, my voice echoing through the courtyard. "He has remembered his promise. He has sent his Redeemer. The long night is over." People turned to look. The priests paused mid-step. The murmurs grew, but I didn't care. I wasn't speaking to them. I was speaking to heaven. My tears kept falling, each one carrying a lifetime of waiting, of pain, of hope that had refused to die. I had spent decades talking to God. But now I was looking at his answer. He was so small, so fragile. Yet everything in me knew, this was strength wrapped in weakness. This was the Creator in the arms of his creation. I wanted to touch his hand, but I didn't dare. I just stood there, trembling, smiling, weeping. The child yawned softly, and I felt laughter rise in my chest. Not the laughter of mockery or surprise, but the laughter of relief, the sound that comes when waiting finally ends. I leaned closer and whispered through my tears, "I prayed to see you before I died. And here you are." Mary's eyes softened. She nodded slightly, and in that small gesture I saw something divine, the quiet strength of a woman chosen by God to hold eternity in her arms. Simeon placed the baby back into her hands. His own hands lingered a moment longer, as though reluctant to let go. Then he stepped aside and looked at me. "Anna," he said softly, "you prayed for this too." I could only nod. My throat felt too tight to answer. I lifted my face to heaven and let out a sound I had not made in years. A laugh mixed with a cry, a song mixed with prayer. The people around me began to whisper, but I didn't stop. My hands rose, my tears fell, my heart burst open in worship. I didn't care who saw me. I didn't care if they thought I was mad. I had waited through hunger, through silence, through loneliness and loss. And now I was standing in the presence of the promise itself. My heart felt light, so light I thought it might lift me off the ground. The child's face was calm, peaceful, yet his presence filled the air with more power than any king who had ever lived. And in that moment, every memory of sorrow, every ache of the years, every lonely night, all of it vanished like smoke. Pain had no voice here. Only joy did. I closed my eyes and whispered again, "Thank you, Lord. You did not forget me." The sounds of the temple faded. All I could hear was the faint breathing of the child, the heartbeat of heaven now resting in human arms. For the first time in my life I felt completely whole. It was as if time itself had stopped to let me breathe in this one sacred moment. I had spent my life waiting for a word from God. But now I realized the word had come as a child. And he was here. I pressed my hand over my heart and smiled through the tears. Every prayer I ever prayed had been answered in one heartbeat. My tears were still warm on my cheeks when I stood up from the place where I had seen the child. My legs were trembling, my breath unsteady, but my heart felt like a song that had been trapped inside me for decades, finally breaking free. For years I had lived in silence. The kind of silence that listens, the kind that waits. But now I could not stay quiet any longer. I looked again at the baby in Mary's arms. His tiny fingers moved, his eyes half open, his face calm as morning light. I whispered one last time, "You are here. You are truly here." Then something inside me burst open like a river that could no longer be contained. I turned and I began to move. At first it was just a few steps. Then faster. Then running. Yes, running. My old feet, weak and slow for years, suddenly found strength I didn't know was left in them. My robes swayed behind me as I ran through the temple courts. People turned to stare. They had seen me for years, always sitting in corners, always quiet, always praying. But not that day. That day I ran. That day I shouted. "He is here." I cried. My voice echoed against the stone walls. The Redeemer has come. The promise is alive. Some stopped and stared. Others frowned, thinking I had lost my mind. But I didn't care. Let them think what they wanted. I had seen him. I had seen the salvation of Israel with my own eyes. The temple was full that day. Priests preparing incense, travelers carrying doves, mothers holding their children. I went from one group to another, breathless but smiling. "The Lord has remembered us," I said. "The Messiah is here. The child the prophets spoke about, he has come." Their faces shifted from confusion to curiosity. Some followed me, wondering what I meant. Some laughed softly. But there were others, a few, just a few, whose eyes widened. They felt it too. That pull. That holy trembling that only comes when God is near. An old man carrying a lamb stopped me. "What are you saying, woman?" he asked. I grabbed his arm, my voice shaking. "I have seen him. The child of the promise. The Savior." His eyes filled with tears before I even finished speaking. He didn't need proof. He believed. I went on. Every breath I took felt like fire. Every word I spoke felt like prophecy. I didn't have to think about what to say. The words poured out of me like they had been waiting at the edge of my lips for years. People began to gather, whispering my name. "It's Anna," they said. "The prophetess. The widow who prays." Yes, it was me. But not the same me. The years of silence had ended. My voice, the same voice that had whispered prayers in the dark, was now shouting for all to hear. I told anyone who would listen. "He has come for the broken, for the weary, for the forgotten. He has come for you." A group of young girls who often helped with temple offerings stood nearby, their faces shining with wonder. I took their hands and said, "Don't stop praying. The God who heard me will hear you too. His timing is perfect." They smiled through their tears, and I felt hope rising in the air like incense. Everywhere I turned, I saw faces. Some believing, some doubting, all listening. The temple, which had seen so many rituals, was now hearing something different. Not sacrifice. Not law. Not ceremony. But life. Promise. Joy. Simeon stood in the distance, his hands still trembling from holding the child. Our eyes met and he smiled, the kind of smile that said, "We did it. We saw him." The people crowded around us, asking, "Who is this child? Where is he from?" I pointed toward Mary and Joseph, who stood quietly near the entrance. Mary held the baby close to her chest, her face glowing like someone who carried light itself. "There," I said softly, my voice cracking, "there is the hope of the world." Some followed my gaze. Some didn't understand. But the words had been spoken. The sound had been released. Heaven had its witness. I stayed in the temple all that day, telling anyone who would stop long enough to listen. Even as my voice grew hoarse and my feet ached, I couldn't stop. It felt like fire in my bones. I spoke to merchants, to women, to priests, to strangers. My story poured out again and again. How God had remembered his people, how he had kept his word. And though I was just one old woman among thousands, my voice carried. It echoed through halls and hearts, reaching places my feet could never go. For the first time, I didn't feel like the woman who waited. I felt like the woman who witnessed. The sound of my voice filled the temple, mixing with the songs of the Levites, with the cooing of doves, with the laughter of children. And I realized, heaven was listening too. Every tear I had cried had been turned into testimony. Every lonely night had become a seed of joy. Every silent year had prepared me for this very day. As the sun began to set, painting the sky above the temple with gold and rose, I sat down breathless. My body was tired, but my heart was still running. I looked up at the sky and whispered, "So this is why you made me wait." The temple bells rang for evening prayers and I smiled. All around me, people still talked about the strange old woman who wouldn't stop shouting about a baby. Some mocked. Some smiled. Some believed. But I didn't care about the reactions. The message wasn't mine to control. It was mine to deliver. And I had delivered it. For years my voice had been quiet, buried under time and tears. But that day, it became the trumpet of a promise fulfilled. That day the silence of waiting gave birth to the sound of joy. And as I leaned back against the temple wall, my heart still trembling with holy fire, I whispered with a smile. I had been silent for years. Now I could not stop speaking. After that day the temple never felt the same. The air was lighter. The songs sounded sweeter. Every step I took seemed to echo with purpose. People still came and went, some remembering my words, others forgetting them as soon as they left. But it didn't matter. I had seen the promise with my own eyes. My mission was no longer waiting. It was shining. I returned to my quiet place by the eastern wall. The same spot where I had prayed for years, cried for years, listened for years. Only this time there was no ache in my chest. No heaviness in my spirit. Just peace. I would watch the people who came to worship. Young mothers holding babies, old men carrying doves, little boys running between the pillars. Sometimes I would close my eyes and whisper, "He has come for you. You just don't know it yet." The temple guards still nodded respectfully when they passed me. The priests would smile kindly. Some of the younger women began to come near, sitting by my side as I prayed. They would ask me questions in soft voices. "Mother Anna," they said, "how did you keep believing for so long?" I would smile, my wrinkled hands folded in my lap. "Because when God speaks, time cannot silence his voice," I'd answer. "Even if he takes long, he never forgets." Their eyes would widen. Some would weep. Others would stay in silence, their hearts listening more than their ears. I began to teach them, not with grand words or lofty speeches but with stories. Stories of waiting, of trust, of nights that felt endless but were never wasted. Faith, I would tell them, is not about getting what you want. It's about staying when you could walk away. It's about believing when your heart says it's over. They would nod, holding my hands. Sometimes they brought food, sometimes oil for my lamp, sometimes nothing but company, and that was enough. As the years passed, my body began to slow down. My steps grew shorter. My hands shook more often. Some days my voice came out like a whisper of dust. But my spirit, oh, my spirit felt younger than ever. I could still feel that same holy fire burning inside me, the one that had carried me through widowhood, loneliness, and decades of waiting. Only now it burned softer, warmer, steadier. Like the last flame in a lamp before the dawn. Every evening as the sun dipped low, I would sit quietly and watch the light fall across the temple floor. The golden glow would spread across the stones, touching everything. The pillars, the altars, the faces of those praying nearby. And I would whisper, "That's how his light spreads too, slowly, quietly, but it reaches everyone." Sometimes I would think of Mary. I never saw her again, but I often prayed for her. The young woman chosen to carry what the world could not understand. I would picture the child growing, walking, speaking, laughing. I knew one day he would do greater things than the world could ever dream. That thought alone would make me smile. The nights were colder now, and the wind from the hills of Jerusalem carried a strange stillness with it. But even in that stillness I found joy. Because I knew what it meant. The world was still noisy. People still hurried. But inside my heart there was only calm. The younger women would sometimes find me sitting by the lamp, humming softly. "Are you tired, Mother Anna?" they would ask. And I would smile. "No, my dear. I'm not tired. I'm just full." They didn't always understand what I meant, but one day they would. Every sunrise felt like grace. Every sunset felt like mercy. I had stopped counting the days long ago. I was counting blessings instead. One morning as I prayed, my voice cracked with age, but my words came out strong. "Lord," I said softly, "I don't need another sign. I've seen enough. I just want to keep praising you until my breath runs out." Tears rolled down my cheeks, not from sadness but from sweetness. The kind of sweetness that comes when you know your life has not been wasted. There were still days of weakness, days when my hands ached or my vision dimmed. But even then, when I could not kneel, I would whisper prayers from where I sat. And I knew He heard me. He had always heard me. Sometimes I would look around the temple and remember how it used to be when I was young. Crowded, noisy, full of people who thought God was far away. And I would smile because now I knew better. He was never far. We were the ones who took long to see Him. In the evenings I would lift my face toward the stars and remember that night when I saw the child. The memory would come like a warm breeze. The soft light, the tiny hands, the sound of heaven in a baby's breath. And I would whisper, that was the moment my waiting ended and my living began. Each night I thanked God for letting me stay just a little longer. Not because I feared death, but because I loved seeing what He was doing. New children were being born. New hearts were learning to believe. New voices were rising in worship. The promise I had seen as a baby in arms was now becoming a song in the hearts of many. I didn't have strength to walk as far as before, but my prayers still reached farther than any feet could go. I would often fall asleep praying, the lamp burning beside me, my heart whispering one last thought before sleep came. "Thank you for remembering me, Lord. Thank you for letting me see your glory." The temple had become my whole world, but it was no longer a place of waiting. It was a doorway to something greater. I knew my time was close. I could feel it, not in fear but in peace. Like the gentle closing of a book whose story had reached its perfect ending. One evening, as the sun sank and the last light of day painted the temple gold, I looked up and smiled. The sky was beautiful, wide, endless, glowing like heaven had opened its window. I whispered to the quiet air, I was not waiting for death anymore. I was waiting for glory. And I knew in that moment that glory was waiting for me too. I used to think waiting was a punishment. I used to believe that silence meant God had turned His face away. But now, sitting here at the close of my days, I understand. Waiting was never a prison. It was a classroom. It was the holy ground where faith learned how to breathe. All those years I spent in the temple, watching, praying, crying, they were not wasted. They were shaping me. God was not ignoring me. He was preparing me. I didn't see it then. I only felt the ache, the endless days, the slow passing of time. But every sunrise was a whisper from heaven saying, hold on a little longer. Sometimes the greatest miracles are not what you receive, but who you become while you wait. I used to ask God for signs. I wanted fire, thunder, something I could touch. But instead He gave me silence, and in that silence I found Him. I learned that when God is quiet, it doesn't mean He is gone. It means He is working where your eyes cannot see. The younger women still come to me. They sit around as the evening light fades and listen to my stories. I tell them what I wish someone had told me long ago. Don't curse the waiting, I say softly. The waiting is where faith grows its roots. Some of them cry. Some just nod. They remind me of who I once was, restless, hopeful, and afraid that maybe God had forgotten my name. But I tell them, He never forgets. His timing may hurt, but it is always holy. I pause and look at their faces, young, full of questions. Do you know why waiting feels so long? I ask. Because God is building something eternal inside you, not temporary comfort. They listen. Some take my hands. And I can feel their hearts beating with the same hunger I once had. I tell them about my years of loneliness. How I prayed through nights when no answer came. How I watched others get what I longed for. Children, families, laughter. while I had only prayers and empty arms. But then I smile and say, what I didn't see was that he was holding something better for me. Not a child of my own, but the child who would save the world. Their eyes glisten when I say it. Because even now, after all these years, the memory still brings warmth to my soul. Waiting didn't take life from me. It gave me meaning. If I had filled my life with noise, I would have missed the whisper. If I had rushed ahead, I would have missed the moment. God's delays are never denials. They are the pauses where heaven prepares the perfect time. I've seen enough to know that sometimes his greatest gifts are wrapped in silence. I tell the girls, when you don't hear him, don't run away. Sit still. Keep your lamp burning. Because one day when you least expect it, he will walk in, just like he did for me. They smile, but some still look uncertain. And that's all right. Faith doesn't grow in one conversation. It grows in seasons. When they leave, I sit quietly again, watching the lamps flicker in the temple. The same lamps I lit as a young woman now cast their glow on my wrinkled hands. The years have taken many things from me, my strength, my sight, my voice. But they have given me something the world cannot take. Peace. I understand now that God's silence was not rejection. It was preparation. Every unanswered prayer was bending me toward the promise. Every lonely night was tuning my heart to hear his voice. Waiting well is not about sitting still. It's about trusting even when nothing moves. Sometimes I think about the young girl I once was, standing in this same temple wondering if my life mattered. I wish I could whisper to her now, it will all make sense one day. Every tear will have a purpose. When I close my eyes, I still see him, that tiny child wrapped in cloth, the one whose breath carried eternity. His face never left my heart. His presence never left my life. That day taught me that God always comes. Not early, not late, but right on time. If you are reading this or hearing this and you feel forgotten, listen to me, you are not forgotten. Heaven knows your name. The God who found me in the temple will find you where you are. Don't give up. Don't lose heart. Keep praying even when it feels like no one is listening. Keep believing even when the promise seems far away. Because waiting is not the absence of God. Waiting is the proof that he is doing something bigger than you can see. I waited a lifetime, but when the promise came, one moment erased all the pain. So I tell everyone who asks, those who wait on the Lord never wait in vain. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Waiting isn't wasted time, it's where faith grows wings. Now tell me, what story would you like to hear next? Should we uncover the story of Hannah, the woman who prayed in silence? Type it in the comments. And if you felt something while watching this, hit like, subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to be reminded. God's silence is never his absence. Because somewhere in the waiting, heaven is already moving.